Okay, let's dive straight in. We're unpacking a really fascinating moment in Dutch politics right now. It's all centered on the Schoof cabinet and, well, a specific point of tension involving Geert Wilders and his asylum proposals.
Right. And we've got a stack of sources here, news articles, some commentary, giving us a glimpse, really, into what's going on inside that coalition.
Exactly, and also how it's being seen, by the public and the media.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to understand the core events, try to figure out what these sources suggest about the motivations at play,
Mm,
and explore the potential implications for the whole political landscape.
sounds good. Where do we start?
Okay, so let's set the scene from our sources.
Mm.
About a week ago, Geert Wilders laid out these 10 points
Yeah.
on asylum policy.
Okay.
And what the sources describe is an initial reaction from the other coalition partners that was, well, distinctly cool. One piece actually calls it a fresh reluctance.
Fresh reluctance, huh?
Yeah. And you see these quotes from people basically saying things like, why would I bother reheating this dish? Or even sort of batting questions away, like, go ask your own minister.
So basically trying to downplay it.
Right. It wasn't presented as anything they were particularly impressed by, just, more political noise leading to all sorts of press conferences, as one put it.
Okay. Standard procedure, perhaps.
But then the dynamic shifted pretty dramatically, actually.
Yeah.
While initially the vibe was sort of no threat, but not exactly enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Wilders went on to X Twitter over the weekend and, well, he escalated things. He explicitly stated that if certain points aren't adopted, we leave.
Wow, okay. So that changes things.
Completely. It takes it from being just a proposal to a clear ultimatum, a direct threat.
Right. No ambiguity there.
So the central question these sources really force us to ask is today actually going to be some kind of crisis point?
Yeah.
Could it bring down the cabinet? Or is this, as one source puts it, maybe just another time something was said and nothing happens?
The big question.
And maybe more importantly, why is Wilders doing this now? And what does all this constant uncertainty actually mean for the country?
Well, what's really striking from the sources is precisely that rapid escalation you just described. They show how this specific set of policy ideas, initially kind of shrugged off,
Yeah, dismissed almost.
was then quickly amplified by Wilders into a potential cabinet-ending moment that moved from a somewhat vague presentation to a very direct, very public threat on X. That's a key point the analyses are highlighting.
Right.
And this immediately brings up a core question that, the sources are grappling with. What is the actual strategy behind this, according to these reports? Is there one?
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What do the sources tell us about Wilder's actions and what might be driving them?
Well, you've got the sequence you mentioned.
Propose the points, wait a week, then boom, escalate sharply over the weekend with the we leave threat. The timing feels very pointed, doesn't it?
It does, and the sources offer a couple of interpretations for this. One perspective suggests that Wilders might feel he can't keep threatening indefinitely without, following through.
Like his threats lose credibility.
Maybe. Or perhaps because he believes the cabinet is heading for a fall soon anyway, regardless of the specific issue. So maybe it's pushing something that's already leaning.
Okay, that's one angle with you.
Another view, perhaps a bit more cynical, presented in the sources questions whether there's a coherent strategy at all.
Oh.
Yeah, suggesting it could simply be screaming, calling for attention, just making noise.
Why would they think that? Just noise.
Well, because, as this analysis points out, Wilders might be quite aware that if this coalition does collapse, his options for forming a new one are actually pretty limited.
Ah, right. Who would work with him?
Exactly. Few parties, perhaps only the VVD, which is described, interestingly, as becoming quite an opportunistic party, would likely partner with him. So maybe the noise is because real power is limited.
So it's either a calculated gamble on an eventual collapse, or maybe just making maximum noise, because he knows his political leverage is actually quite restricted if the government were to fall. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you look at these accounts, what does it feel like to you? More strategic or more reactive?
It's hard to say for sure just from these snippets, but the sources definitely lean into that ambiguity. And connecting this specific tension to the broader picture the sources paint, well, there's a significant consequence for the political climate.
How so?
Reports indicate that, at the start of this cabinet's term, there was maybe a degree of renewed trust in politics among the public, but that feeling has now reportedly just dissipated,
Oh,
gone.
yeah, I've seen that mentioned.
So this constant instability, the recurring threat of collapse, that the sources really ask, what does this dynamic actually do with the country, with the voters? How does it shape their whole view on politics? It just creates this persistent atmosphere of uncertainty, doesn't it?
It must be exhausting for people following it.
Yeah.
And tucked within the sources, though, there is a slightly more hopeful interpretation.
Oh, yeah.
You could imagine, one suggests, that people will realize that voting for such a populist party doesn't yield much in practice. The idea being that maybe seeing this kind of internal conflict and, well, potential dysfunction might make voters reconsider next time.
The actions have consequences theory for voters.
Sort of.
But the sources are also quick to introduce the counterpoint. They acknowledge that you just don't know how voters will actually react.
Right, it's not always logical.
Exactly. Sometimes, even when the tension is obvious, blame might still be placed elsewhere, The analysis mentions that polarization has been a long-standing factor in Dutch politics anyway.
Sure.
And moments like this might just bring it more clearly to the surface. They even point to examples elsewhere in Europe, like that narrow nationalist win in Poland, as sort of context for this kind of 50-50 split you often see in electorates.
Yeah, that makes sense. And here's where the sources offer a particularly, I think, thought-provoking insight. They dig into why people might vote the way they do, specifically for someone like Wilders.
Okay. What do they suggest?
It suggests the motivation might actually be much more superficial than we all think.
Superficial. How?
Potentially not based on substance. Instead, it could be driven by something as simple as liking a man who happens to make a few good jokes on TV.
Really?
Or maybe stemming from just a kind of irritation about the VVD after their long stretch 12 years in power. The act of voting is framed, in one quite striking phrase, as following the Pied Piper, the Rattenvanger von Harmelen, the Dutch idiom.
Wow, the Pied Piper. That's quite an image. So less about policy, more about vibe.
Or
Great hostess.
that seems to be the implication in that analysis, yeah.
And adding another layer to that, research cited in the sources suggests that actually a strong undercurrent of conservatism has always existed in the Netherlands.
Right.
Now, perhaps people just felt they finally had permission or an opportunity to vote for it with the specific hope that the PVV would actually enter government this time.
Okay, so a latent sentiment finding an outlet.
Exactly. So when you put these analyses together, the idea that voting could be based on personality or irritation combined with this underlying conservative impulse, it really raises a fundamental question, doesn't it?
Which is?
What does that imply for political stability, for that often expressed desire for a normal cabinet with middle parties versus those perceived, maybe unfairly sometimes, as just screamers?
That's a really key question. And this discussion about, the dynamics within the cabinet and how figures are perceived, it naturally leads us to focus on one minister who seems to feature pretty prominently in the media landscape surrounding this government, Arlene Faber.
Ah, yes, Minister Faber.
The sources describe her as one of the most discussed ministers in this cabinet since it took office, about a year ago. Her position, her public appearances, they seem to be a constant point of media interest.
She certainly gets attention.
And last weekend, apparently both the Telegraph and NRC published these portraits, trying to sort of capture who she is.
Right, I saw mentions of those.
The sources note they had different approaches. The NRC looking more at her background, her political journey, maybe, while the Telegraph reportedly spoke to lots of people, specifically probing this question of whether she actually fails as we might perceive her to be.
Interesting contrast. Did the sources think the portraits worked?
Well, the analysis in the sources offers a degree of skepticism, actually, about how successful these portraits really were in, truly capturing her essence. They pose the question, is she actually failing at her job? Or is the sense that maybe there's not much behind her simply because she's, maybe not very good at the ministerial role, which, according to the sources, is sometimes noticeable in her public demeanor.
So it's a question of competence versus something else, or maybe just perception.
Could be. The sources also point out a perceived lack of interviews with her. They suggest she likely just declines them.
Which makes it harder to judge, of course.
Exactly. And they even question whether an interview, if she gave one, would even reveal much substantive depth anyway.
Ooh, that's pretty critical.
Yeah. And the NRC's attempt, specifically, to trace her ideological development, that transition from a VVD background to the PVV and adopting this strong anti-Islam stance that's highlighted.
What did they find?
Well, the sources note that this significant step remained largely absent or unexplained in the reporting. There's a clear sense of curiosity about this shift.
You'd want to know, wouldn't you?
Right. What combination of events or changes in someone's life leads to such a dramatic political move? But then a more reflective point is made in the analysis.
Which is?
Do we always need some dramatic life event to explain these political shifts? Or are we just predisposed, as observers, to want to peel back layers like an onion, always assuming there's some hidden, complex reason?
That's a fair point. Sometimes maybe it's simpler or just different than we expect. And it's important to acknowledge, as the sources do, that her outspoken anti-Islam stance is certainly characterized as an extreme opinion.
It is. It's a defining feature of her public persona associated with the PVV line.
And one perspective offered in the sources regarding this stance is quite blunt.
How so? It says the scary part is the perceived lack of genuine discussion with her about it. One analysis goes as far as to suggest that her brain capacity in that area sits in the head of Geert Wilders.
Wow.
And she essentially tanks her one-liners and answers there, implying, a lack of independent political thought on these core issues.
So basically just repeating talking points from the party leader.
That's the strong suggestion in that piece, yeah. And it raises a critical point. If her current political positions and responses are seen as directly channeled from Wilders, does her past VVD background really offer much insight into her political identity now? Does it even matter?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. It also leads to questioning whether she functions as a true VAC minister, an expert minister in her specific portfolio. Right. Does she have the deep knowledge?
The sources hint that maybe not, suggesting she might not have a deep grasp of, say, the history of the buildup of the number of people with an Islam background in the Netherlands.
But she wants to push a particular narrative anyway?
Exactly. Wants to sell a view that this situation is inherently terrible, whether the deep historical context is there or not. Although, it's acknowledged that journalists are understandably drawn to writing about her. I mean, the fact that the Telegraph piece involves speaking to so many people shows that journalistic curiosity is there. They really dived in.
Yeah, people want to understand she's a minister, a public figure.
Especially since she's a minister who clearly sparks public interest and, well, a desire to understand her role and influence better.
Makes sense.
So, okay, pulling together the threads from these sources, and we've explored the scoof cabinet facing this potential flashpoint, driven by Wilder's escalating demands on asylum policy.
Right, a real moment of tension.
And this tension plays out against a backdrop of, well, shifting public trust, complex voter motivations that might not always line up with traditional policy analysis.
That superficiality idea.
Yeah, and intense media focus on key figures like Minister Faber, which raises all sorts of questions about political substance versus just perception.
Yeah, the sources definitely provided some really sharp insights there. Into the strategic guesswork around Wilder's ultimatum, is it calculated pressure or is just seeking attention? That remains a bit open.
Right.
And they painted that nuanced picture of why people vote, suggesting it might be more influenced by personality and frustration than perhaps we often assume.
Which have big implications.
Huge. And they highlighted the challenge the media faces, and maybe all of us face, in understanding figures like Minister Faber, whose public image and perceived depth or lack thereof are subjects of so much analysis and debate.
So hopefully, this deep dive into the source material gives you, the listener, a much richer understanding of the specific pressures, the underlying dynamics, and the media narratives shaping Dutch politics right now, showing just how intricate the picture really is beneath those headlines.
Absolutely. And maybe here's a final thought, building on these insights, for you to consider. If, as some sources suggest, voter choice can be heavily influenced by personality or just irritation, rather than solely by policy substance, and if political figures are sometimes perceived as lacking independent depth or maybe not engaging in genuine discussion, what does this imply for the long-term stability and direction of political systems?
Not just in the Netherlands.
Exactly, but more broadly, how do you, as someone navigating this often confusing information landscape, decide which political figures or which movements actually have the substance that genuinely matters? Something to think about.